This is a pre-recorded talk for the Neuroergonomics Conference of 2021. Thank you so much for tuning in for my talk today on the non-competing demand's influence on information processes. I'm Betsy Fox, and I could not have done this work without my research team, and that consists of Michelle, Maggie, and Brian. Thank you so much for your contributions to this research. I'd like to start off with defining multitasking. So people are often engaging in two or more tasks simultaneously. That's what we call multitasking. And it can benefit or harm performance. And there's several influences of multitasking performance, such that the degree of demands of the task highly influences how much you can take on, the similarity in the task that you're attempting to complete simultaneously, such that humans have a finite amount of expendable attentional resources. And the more that the multiple tasks demands the same types of resources or overlap of resource demands, then the greater the observed decrement is going to have. And Wickens came along in the 80s and developed multiple resource theory, such that there's competition for various types of attentional resources, and that contributes to the variation in multitask performance, such that the more that you separate among the stages, so the perception, cognition, response, and the modalities of input, so visual, audio, and more recently tactile inputs, access codes, so that's your things like the cognitive processes involved with spatial navigating or verbal manipulation. And then we have responses, such that you can have multiple manual or vocal responses that are more or less competing for the same types of resources. So the less that you demand from the same pool, the more that you can complete simultaneously. More specifically, we're interested in this phenomenon of inattentional deafness that Fred and others have developed a large research pool on, especially within the neuroergonomics community. And this is often resulting from cross-modal overload. So what they found that is with increases in a visual task, you see that there's more failures of detecting an auditory oddball. So this is a low versus high load, and that is in flight simulators as well as actual in-flight. And they'll measure neural activity, but just this primary effect is found with performance. So that's the number of misses versus the number of hits of this auditory cue. And so what we've done is that until now, we've really only focused on the detection of these infrequent auditory oddballs. And what we want to do is investigate how visual task demands influence not just the detection of perceptual events, but also the cognitive mechanisms involved with spoken letter manipulation. So I'll describe the task a little more detail later. And the verbal response execution. So we're requiring people to vocally say things out loud. And the idea with this is that we have two tasks that in theory are taxing independent pools of attentional resources. So we have a visual spatial manual. So that's the resources highlighted in red on the left. And then we have a auditory, verbal, vocal, which is those red resources highlighted on the right. And in theory, they are non-overlapping with multiple resource theory predicts should show no or very little performance deficits. So our first research question is looking at the visual spatial manual task demands influence on the secondary task. And our second research question is looking at, do the visual spatial manual task demands influence early auditory processing? So this is looking at effects similar to inattentional deafness research has shown in the past with the N100 ERP component, such that there is a stronger N100 for hits and a reduced effect found with misses in CZ and PZ. Our third research question is digging a bit deeper, such that we want to look at controlling for the multitask demands. Do we see that the N100 component is further reduced when the operator fails to respond? To describe the tasks a little bit, so we have a visual task that is tracking, and the participant is monitoring these restricted areas, which are gray on here, the quadrants that are gray, and each suspicious target has to be accompanied by a security guard. So each red has to be accompanied by a green, and they have to press buttons to turn on and off alarms accordingly. In a more difficult condition, they're monitoring 2 quadrants instead of 1, and they have 4 buttons, so 2 on and 2 off of the alerts instead of just the left side or the right side. They're doing both. The targets actually looked like this, and we had to manipulate this because we wanted the difficulty of the task to be quite challenging. So in a 1 quadrant condition, it looked like this. And then here is an example of how fast the dots were moving. And it was quite difficult for participants. We had several days of training of a 6-session experiment. 4 of those were training of either an individual task or the dual task condition. In the audio task, there was warning tones, either a high or low pitched tone. Their target was a high frequency. And on 40% of the trials, they were followed by a set of a 4-letter string of different types of speakers from this isolate data set. And they were to listen to and decrypt the letters that followed the high frequency tone. And to decrypt them, they were modifying the first and last letter to that which follows in the alphabet. So for instance, in this trial here, they heard C-O-A-J. They were to decrypt C and J, and they would say out loud D-K. The primary task was always a visual task similar to a real world scenario, such as in flight. You're definitely in charge of monitoring that visual field, and then critical audio alerts and decryptions could be something secondary with communications. So to take a look at our results, we did find that the audio verbal vocal task performance decreased when it was paired with the high versus the low visual spatial manual demands. This was all except for 1 participant, such that they were not prioritizing the tasks as instructed. So if you look at the groupings here, you can see that the purple and the blue go together for the low visual demands, and then the green and the red for the high. So if we group those together, we can see that the purple and blue group is higher than the green and red lines, and that is evidence suggesting that our hypothesis 2 was supported. Looking at research question 3, visually, we are not finding support for this, such that the green and red are grouped quite tightly, and the purple and blue are grouped quite tightly, meaning that there was no difference after controlling for the task demands in the visual task between hits and misses. So what all does this mean? Our results are suggesting that while increased demands of the resource independent tasks, so there's no overlap in those red, of the early perceptual processes of tones. So the N100 for the low was higher than the N100 for the high. However, we did not find that these reductions further occur when the subjects have misses versus hits. Rather, we found that the visual spatial manual task demands, regardless of difficulty, might be influencing later cognitive and response stages in this auditory verbal vocal task. And we did not find the traditional effects of inattentional deafness found in early perceptual processes of simple auditory stimuli. Rather, we found that overall processes are decreased, but not necessarily more so to misses than to hits. In conclusion, the N100 response to auditory targets was reduced when the visual spatial manual task demands are increased. Controlling for the cross-modal difficulty level, it appears the N100 did not further reduce for trials with no response, so the misses versus hits that we found. And we suggest that performance deficits might be due to a failure to encode the spoken letters, translate, or formalize a response as opposed to inattentional deafness to the tone. Our study, however, did have low target prevalence, so 20% to induce inattentional deafness that has been found in the research, and we had high miss rates. So there was severe impact to the statistical power for our behavioral and our neural data, and we'd like to collect more data per subject, and currently we're increasing our sample size, so collecting more subjects to confidently interpret the results of our study. And our neurobehavioral approach can provide estimates of efficiency to diagnose resource bottlenecks and limitations in real world settings. And so we're aiming to further develop this model to determine why multitask performance degrades and demonstrate the degree to which separate attentional resource pools influence one another in demanding multitask environments. Thank you so much for your attention. And I would take any questions here in the chat and the conference overall if you want to find me at Neuroergonomics, or you can email me here at my AFRL email. Thank you so much.